Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for your participation in this event. It's a huge honor to have you here, especially with your tight schedule. And to start this conversation, I will ask you a question about perspectives of growth in the Latin America. I think the prospects have haunted many regions when it comes to the fellow reserves. How do you see this region and how do you see the level of concern, especially with these risks that can impact the prospects of growth? Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be back to Brazil, even if for a few days. I think we ought to separate what is situational, which is cyclical, a cycle of monetary tightening, and a moment to reduce global inflation and other more structural matters. I would like to start talking about the monetary tightening, which has a lot to do with this inflation and the last shocks during the pandemic. And then the Russian invasion of Ukraine giving us an important shock when it comes to the economy, and inflation has gone up. The central banks have been attempting to reduce it, and the global economies face more interest rates around the world. When it comes to the cycles, what I see is a cycle that has an impact that from one hand, a reduction of speed in the global economy has an impact over commodities, and it has been less intense than in the beginning. Developing nations have felt that impact, and this impact is not that strong in developing countries. Latin America is suffering a bit less from it. And on the other hand, the rest of the world notices that interest rates are growing, and therefore it affects debts and payment and how it's going to be done. We are observing a higher demand and more solicitation for technical help in the conversion of debt when it comes to goals, for example. And they are goals in development. In the case of, for example, the BID has supported an exchange of debt in exchange for resources that are being moved to Galapagos. And it was the biggest in the world, which can only be executed through guarantees and politics, so that you can issue and benefit Ecuador because of that difference. And that is a sign that debt is a matter at hand. So we see a cycle of interest rates, monetary tightening, and some kind of deceleration, but it's not the kind of deceleration that you would imagine. Okay, so perhaps also looking at the global scenario and how that impacts Latin America, but also seeing that we are going through geopolitical disruptions, which is today's theme. We in Eurasia view a very conturbated geopolitical situation and between America and China. It's very grim, and we have debated these geopolitical questions and transformations Of course, they have to do with climate and technology, and they have an impact on Latin America. And so offshoring and all kinds of shoring can be beneficial to Latin America. And for example, everyone looks at Mexico as an economy that is benefiting from that. Do you concur with that thesis? And do you agree with this geopolitical shocks? Are they happening, and in which way? Yes, I do feel that there is a moment, maybe of inflection towards the Latin America, and I feel that because we have the American bank, which is a bank that is very present in all 26 countries. We see a model of decentralization which is adopted in many different countries, in different regions, and I am telling that because within these 26 countries, 22 members of the bank are not do not belong to these regions. And we are the conductors, we are the common line in Latin America. Therefore, there is this matter, if there is or not an inflection. It's a very important point, and I think one of the points in geopolitics is the perception that Latin America has values, shared values with Europe and with the Western world in the pursuit of the rules of the game when it comes to the democratic ideals. And there is this whole political stability in the pursuit of it, and they are speaking in the same language, basically. And the perception is that there is a common ground with that continent. That gives us a more clear view of the world and of this important polarization. And one of the roles that need to be executed, there is the economic role that has many opportunities. In this polarized world, the point is to be the voice of moderation, to meet people halfway, and to search a meeting point between each and every part to resolve conflict. And that is super important to advance and find development and opportunities to enhance economic development. Today, there is the perception that the world is searching development, and these global challenges are being drawn in, which cannot be solved by one country or by one continent, and not even by developed countries. And little by little, I think it will become more clear how we can solve this. First of all of this climate change discussion has to occur with changes from the energetic source involving populations that cannot avoid this conversation, especially the ones with average income. We have to address all countries, including the ones that have poverty. Now, the regions with average income, it's uncertain whether I will address global warming, but inadvertently it has to be a part of the discussion. But we have to go beyond not only can we not ignore. But when we look at the initial patterns, Latin America have a much more favorable condition than many other regions. They have clean sources of energy, uh, amounting to 40% of the total of the region's energy. In Central America, many have 80% of clean energy. The projection shows growth, and the perception that has been thought over is that you can become an exporter of clean energy. And that is fundamental as to how the region is seen by Europe, the United States, Asia, and can be relevant for the private and public sectors too. In Venezuela, last week I was in Germany, and there is a 20-year transition project to resolve clean energy supply and to make that switch. That is imported energy, and there is a firm demand for that type of energy. There are many treaties between countries, as well as regional treaties, and they are thinking about green energy. So, number one, the initial conditions in Latin America, given real conditions, are allowing for a global solution. Secondly, the issue of the food crisis that came about with an increase in commodity, with Ukraine's invasion, and it called out the attention to the fact that we have to have other sources of food. And obviously, Latin America is participating in 40% of the global food trade. And the 40% is a whole lot. Producing food for more than 1.2 billion people, and I'll get back to that. And you can feed 10 billion people because you're exporting food to all of the world. And third example, biodiversity, preservation of nature, very important to the climate question. We have many biomes here and other forests in the south of Mexico, and obviously the Amazon is of global interest. And therefore, if you preserve the Amazon well, you will benefit the region. And there are examples in which this importance is obvious. But there is a certain uncertainty as to, well, are you generating the right conditions for investment? Are you adequate in terms of the rules of the game? Are you working to overcome barriers? This story that the natural regions will better themselves automatically, which doesn't seem to be the case. We need to reevaluate our own roles and see in nature an opportunity and actually implement that plan. I think that was very well put, and your position in BID is very privileged, as you put it very well. There is outside infrastructure demands. So let's take a fraction of these topics and narrow down a topic, which is the energetic transition. to this green issue, I think Latin America has an important role. And I would like to ask you if tech advancement is necessary for this green transformation and how we have to advance to reach our full potential. But maybe even more important, how do you see BID amidst all this process and between all of the governments being receptible to work more and receive investments and better these investments made? I think they are ready, even because when there is something distant, for example, something that will work 20 years from now, or when we talk about the developed world, the natural reaction is to think that it has nothing to do with me, but global warming has clearly come, it's clearly here. The first people to complain in a more intense way and to speak up, you have Bridgeton Initiative and leaders from the Caribbean, like Motley of Barbados, a small island, because obviously within the last years, what was a natural disaster 10 years ago now happens from 3 to 3 years instead of 10 to 10. And which something that took 3% of the GDP to fix now demands 10% of the GDP. Obviously, you have no conditions to fund that. So these countries were the first to say, we have a problem there. And to tell you the truth, when I go into BID, I think, well, I have CAIB, I have the climate. This is an emergency to be treated. But within the last few months, I observed that while talking about South America, for example, it's all about climate. And in Argentina, all they talk about is drought, the worst within 100 years that had an economic impact. Or the water in Uruguay, or in Chile, talking about forest fires. When we go north, we have here the impacts of rains and the elements. And in the north, we have forest fires in Canada that had a huge impact. You were there and you see that it really came. Even in Washington, D.C., we used to talk about what we're going to do because we can't breathe anymore. So it's clear, it's crystal clear to everybody that climate change is upon us. In many aspects, it is here. The first aspect is the emergential aspect. Do you have assistance? Do you have aid resources? Well, if it's happening, if there are funds, maybe they can be raised. Well, are there tools to make it better? So we're talking about debt tools that either you sell to the market or fund yourself. So if there is a natural disaster, I put a clause and reduce that debt. Today, the BID already borrows to a few countries, and if there is a natural disaster, they don't need to pay the main bill for 2 years because the size has to be increased. In Paris, we had an event the Paris Macron summit, in which we talked about this instrument, and the idea is to use it as a form of market way for you to insure yourself. And the other part is obviously that we are changing the power source, which you asked. I think this is happening within demand. I see private interest. The private side of Bid Invest is investing. It has a return of investment. I think this is already on its way. For example, you could be investing too much on generation without thinking about transmission. It's a problem. But I would say that this comes with the job, with every change. And finally, to end, you have to adapt these countries to shock for resilience. You have to invest in an infrastructure that supports these natural disasters. You have to change the physical infrastructure, the houses, the bridges, everything, so that they can resist these disasters. And we haven't reached a point in which we have easy products being sold in the market. We have to have a little bit more capacitation. And for example, the project of renewable energy that is upon us. We talked about countries that will make a difference to the global powerhouse, and I think that is bigger countries with average income. We have many small countries, and we can fund changes in the source, but it won't necessarily make a difference globally. And so we have to build up resilience. We have three aspects: the emergential aspect, energetic powerhouse, and adaptation. And the three of them, we have to work in the public sector and think about financial instruments to aid that. Perfect. This agenda seems important to political cycles, which become more dramatic. And then there is a cascade effect within the political setting. So I think the curve has already initiated, but the speed should pick up the pace. So the importance should also pick up the pace. And do you see this tendency? Yeah, because the spur in the public sector, what we call NDB, moderate development banks, such as the World Bank, the Asian Bank, or the European Bank. And talking about the G20, the name of the game is scale and speed. Scale because the size of the challenge is much bigger than the resources available. And the second one, speed. Scale and pace. These are the two words. Let's return to another term, which is a priority of the bank. You mentioned this a lot. These are social themes in the region. When we talk about the social environment, stepping out of the COVID-19 situation, the region has gone through an inflationary crisis that tightened social conditions in low-income families. How do you see that in Latin America, and as well as political repercussions and the role of BID in tackling that challenge? I think it's useful to separate what is situational from what is structural. The situation is all about the pandemic and shocks. It's all about shocks. Many people were led to poverty, and 60 million people brought back to insecurity. There is this side because with food deprivation and with these kinds of shocks, discussing the social situation is relevant. Furthermore, you have scars from the pandemic, problems such as a lack of education. You didn't give your children. The region was one of the most affected by the pandemic. 60 million children and teens were affected by schools closing doors during the pandemic. During 177 days, they were closed. So we have a legacy, a scar of the pandemic, which is important. We undertook research on the education realm, and we discovered that people who graduated high school learned only 27% of what they should, only a third of what they should, whether virtually or not, online or not. It was only a third of the original content. If you transfer that to income, there is a clear relationship between education and income. And the amount lost is 15 million and 18 million dollars, and that is subtracted from the economy, amounted to 17% of the GDP, which is far from 0.1% of the GDP. And that is something to think about. And that is because that is only the situation. The impact of the pandemic, food wise or energy wise. But the conjecture is from a while back. And to answer your question, if I see something more, I think the challenge in the region is social demands that have been made, and that now we have even a bigger deficiency: impatience. So we have poverty, inequality in gender, in race. And the healthcare service is not what we expected it to be, not even in the pandemic. And you notice that the work environment is not as expected. And also, education falls short. And many other climate situations which also fall short. If you're affected by these situations, you become impatient, and the demand for these social situations and structures, if you look at the region, you resonate with that. And just by observing really well, we have people living out on the streets in many countries. We have change in government, from democracy to political extremism. We have changes made halfway in Congress. In some countries, the countries are changing constitution or closing Congress. This has always happened, but in this moment, I think there is a bigger demand for change. Well, right here, what I mean is that there is a bigger demand and less patience to solve this in the future. That means that the officials have to solve this as fast as they can, because this is a promise made on election. And then the second part of the challenge, many countries have a super high debt as well as tax issues. You get out of the pandemic with more debt, less space. So you have more social demands and less resources. And of course, you could say, oh, don't worry, because when time passes by, I will generate more resources and manage it. But in Latin America, you have a decade that was lost. And that is a decade loss in heating the economy. And that is a decade loss in satisfying these economic demands. So the challenge I see is more demands and less resources and less capability of looking forward. This is what I find very complicated. I think this tension is a super major challenge, not only when it comes to an increase of situational pains which accumulate in these social conflicts and culminating into this impatience because the government is only not delivering much. And also these challenges when it comes to structure that require a long-term planning. When it comes to efficiency, exporting clean energy, and so on. Maybe you already included this in your response, but this tension in leadership, in politics, does it interfere when it comes to structuring projects? Or do you see in your position that the governments are doing both simultaneously? My experience with the government is that the emergential and immediate is a huge tension. It is a challenge to dedicate a long amount of time to the structural aspect. For example, when you have a central bank, BC Plus, which is an agenda with these structural matters. Because we want to be independent, we want a payment system which is more exclusive and automatic and less bureaucracy in the system. We came with an agenda, and we don't know if we're going to undertake all of it, but we have a commitment, a public commitment to an agenda that we had to deliver. Obviously, there was an exchange market every day, a bonds market every day, which had many variations. We were never dogmatic, but this is the emergential. Either way, we have to keep space for the BID's advantages, which is the structural mandate. It's a mandate in which I can work on to help a climate crisis, or an infrastructure projects would take 10, 15 years. And the powerhouse projects are bigger. Even the political projects will change the tax system. So we are within the structural realm. And your question is, will I receive a part? I think so. I think the countries need not only the financial resources and resources from a bank that has 22 countries that are not from the region, allows us to make a sort of magic. And what magic is that? You have a bank whose credit rating is AAA, and that it's only because it has open capital, and that is because you have everyone in the bank. So you have AAA. You can have AAA in regions in which there is no AAA, and that gives you a tool to reach structural changes on the long term. But that is not the main point. The main point is the ability throughout time to know these countries structurally, because many times the people who are working in bid are more stable than those in higher positions. So you do have to know what you're dealing with. We have 7 minutes. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to ask a question? You can raise your hands and we will call you. We will give you time to think. And so until everyone has thought about their questions, I will just ask the speaker something. So talking about all of these opportunities for the region, some structural challenges, I would like to make a question about the focus on behalf of these global challenges and make a comparison with the past. Within the bank, how do you feel the reorientation of the trajectory of the bank, and what do you see as a priority compared to the past? I think what is changing is that we no longer have time for these global challenges. We don't have patience with the social aspect or with the climate. And when, in regard to the biodiversity, we also don't have that patience. And so we have to share resources. When I said that the name of the game is pace and scale, I think scale also means that if you want to make a difference, you need to choose 3 fronts to attack and get organized. In the beginning, I told you, well, there are basically 3 realms. The social realm, which is clearly of demand, and it's natural for each and every developing bank or company. But the second one is the climate issue. The region needs to clearly invest in physical infrastructure as well as digital, and to do it regionally. Sometimes we forget to gather countries which can give you, for example, in energy, if you have a sort of transmission between the countries, that can make things easier to take electricity from one to another. We have to integrate regionally, as well as your internet. Today, a great part of the region is ran by Miami's electricity, so we need to bring that over. And finally, the Amazon. So we prioritize these 3. So efficacy and effectivity and effectiveness. We need to really look inward and see if we are improving ourselves. And finally, to use our past experiences to maximize our financial resources. I see there is a question. We have one here and another there. Now, see, you break the ice and everyone is raising their hands. We have one mic here. It's right here in the middle. Are you listening to me? Okay. I am Eduardo Viola from University of São Paulo, and my question to your excellent presentation is, in my view, the energetic transition in Latin America is low compared to what could be. And I see 2 points for this. Firstly, because in South America, the energetic powerhouse has a lower carbon footprint than the ones in Uruguay. So the point is, we have already advanced, so we don't have to advance even more. And the second point, which I see as relevant, is that despite the interests being created in renewable energy in South America, the interests in fossil fuels are also super strong in Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela. So I would like to understand your viewpoint on the topic. Let's have our second question and then you can answer both. And then we will do a ping pong session. Ian, could you answer? Hello, Raphael speaking. I have a totally different question. As you may know, IDB and its role in labeled emissions. But in another hand, when we take a look in ESG and integration, especially because IDB has such a strong presence in Latin America, how do we implement this idea, and what has IDB done in this context? I'm sorry, we will have to stick to 2 questions only. Let me answer the first part of the question. This viewpoint that we should have a clearer powerhouse and that we already have advanced. Well, my only point is that this is a vision of the region that only looks inward. Meaning, do I have enough energy for me that is clean? But completely disregards the global context, because the global context is, does the world has enough energy? We can think individually only, because come to think of the logic, I don't solve an environmental problem alone, and if I do, I don't care about the rest. In practice, this means that you are going to export energy. That goes beyond you, and the rest of the world is in need. If we forget to complete each other, to look at Europe or what America is needing, that is dangerous, and we need to change our mentalities to see which part of the world is in need and help each other. We need to seize this opportunity now that you have the conditions to supply energy for the rest of the world. Let's do more than what we do today. And to answer the last question about regional integration, the governments only serve their citizens. With social demands, your primary reaction has to be, how do I meet their demands immediately? The regional mandate, it comes indirectly. If I have an agreement with Itaipu, that will help me, but it's indirect. BP's mandate is regional to begin with. I don't have a mandate with one country or another, so that mandate comes from us very easily. So, for example, a regional project for the Amazon, we have the resources and all the backup, looking at all the instruments. A project which we call Amazonia Forever, that gathers all 8 countries to solve the situation. So it's beyond one country's borders. And economically, it has to extend these borders. It may seem easy, but the international jurisdictions founded in after 69 were not built. They have a regional mandate, but were not built for regional plans, because you get the project for the region, but then you negotiate with the country. For a regional matter, you still need the whole of the organizations. So these organizations have an agreement, but they were built multilaterally. We have to push for regionalization, the Amazon, electrical transition, and digitalization. And seeing that the session has ended, I will end it here. Thank you very much for your participation. This conversation was excellent.